back around 1987 or 1988, I had an occasion to be in Dallas-Fort Worth area on a law enforcement convention. I had an afternoon off, and I ended up in Dealey Plaza just to see what was there. I didn't have any particular reason to be there other than having been able to say at one time I'd been to the crime scene of the century, and being a police officer at the time, that was something you just did when you travel someplace. The first thing I noticed was how small Dealey Plaza was, and having been a Marine sniper in Vietnam, I found it amazing that it would take anybody with a rifle to do anything there. Probably the assassination of John F. Kennedy could have been accomplished with maybe even a pistol, but the problem I had with it was when I went up to the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository and saw all of the exhibits, all of which basically say, or the majority of which basically say that Lee Harvey Oswald, the lone nut with a gun, fired 3 shots in 5.6 seconds with a 6.5 millimeter Mannlicher Carcano bolt-action rifle and killed John F. Kennedy. Later, he was killed by Jack Ruby. Jack Ruby died, case closed, which was our American history book version of the event. I ended up standing next to the 6th floor window, the infamous so-called sniper's nest, and I looked out the window, and instantaneously I knew that none of that had happened, that somebody in government had lied to us all of these years, and there had to be more involved, more to this homicide scene than we were being told. I think that's when I first got interested in investigating the Kennedy assassination, which led into other investigations of other things that people within our government, not necessarily the government itself, our government's just too big, but people within our government using their positions of power and authority, probably working off of private agendas, were involved with. I knew that those shots couldn't have occurred the way the Warren Commission said. And the more I dug into the case, the more discrepancies I found. I just attempted to work it as a simple homicide, and I found out that witnesses had been intimidated, witnesses had been killed, evidence had been destroyed or changed or lost, that the whole thing was a sham, and that there had to be more people involved in it than Lee Harvey Oswald. If Oswald indeed was anything more than what he said, a patsy himself. And the end result was about an 8-year investigation that ended up with a book that I wrote called Kill Zone: A Sniper Looks at Dealey Plaza. During the writing of that book, I found there were other cases that cropped up with the same people involved that I was running into on the Kennedy assassination, the same entities involved, the same compartmentalized areas of the covert intelligence community and organized crime and international corporations, petroleum companies, all kinds of things that had interest and benefited from the assassination of Kennedy, among other things, up to and including the military-industrial complex, because one of the things that Kennedy, of course, wanted us to do was not get bogged down in a land war in Vietnam, and he exhibited that when he wrote National Security Memorandum 263, which was basically pulling us out of Vietnam at 1,000 troops per month. That was issued in October, about 4 or 5 weeks before Kennedy's death. Interestingly enough, on the 25th of November, just a day or two after Kennedy's funeral, LBJ issued National Security Action Memorandum 273, which basically negated 263 and put us into Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia, and it told state, CIA, and DOD what their roles were to be, and that the entire thing had to be plausibly deniable if ever discovered. It was a top-secret memorandum at the time. We found out later that that memorandum, which was issued over McGeorge Bundy's signature, actually, had been written. The draft copy had been written, and we got a copy of the draft copy, on the 21st of November 1963, which was the day before Kennedy was killed. Now that's extremely suspicious, considering the fact that Kennedy wanted to pull us out of Vietnam, Johnson put us into Vietnam, and it was to be issued by Johnson as president, but had been constructed before Kennedy was even dead. Several other things cropped up. I couldn't help but wonder what had happened in Vietnam when I was in Vietnam in 1965 and 66. when I started seeing some very strange things occur. Being a historian at that time, I noted that corporations and very large companies in the military-industrial complex were benefiting greatly during the war. For instance, previous to Vietnam, all of our infantry weapons were the M1 rifle in World War II in Korea, and then later the M14 when we landed in Vietnam, were all issued by subcontractors. They were built by people doing subcontract work for the U.S. government, and they were such companies as Winchester, Remington, Harrington and Richardson, Rand, and just Smith Corona. I mean, there were so many subcontractors that were building weapons. And then in 1967, Armalite ended up selling out the M16 production line to Colt Firearms. Now, at that time, Colt Firearms took over producing all infantry weapons to Vietnam, one company. The same thing happened basically in the helicopter industry. When we landed in Vietnam in 1965, we had Piasecki, we had Bell, Boeing Vertol, we had Hughes, and Cayman. But within a year or two, all of a sudden, the majority of helicopters being purchased for Vietnam were all being built by Bell Helicopter out of Fort Worth. There were the Boeing Chinooks, the CH-47s and 46s, the heavier helicopters, and Sikorsky was still doing a few Sky Cranes, but all of your combat helicopters and all of your Hueys and the Cobras and all of that, the OH-58 scout ships were being built by one company. And it was a Texas company, and it had connections to LBJ and Lady Bird Johnson. I then also found out that all of our ground vehicles were being pretty much phased out. You had the Dodge Power Wagon, you had which was the 3/4 ton personnel carrier, you had the M38 Jeep, you had the Mighty Mite, and you had the Mechanical Mule. And these things were all being phased out and replaced by one vehicle, which was the M151, built by who? Ford Motor Company. And I got real curious about this in many other instances as well. And I started investigating into this area to find out who owned the controlling interest of those companies during the Vietnam War. Just in the helicopter industry alone, 5,000 helicopters were shot down over a 10-year period. All of them were replaced, so that was a total sale of 10,000 helicopters. I wrote the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and I asked who owned the controlling interest of these companies. And basically, I got the runaround for about 3 months. And the end result was they told me that all the records involving all of those things had been shredded for space-saving purposes, just to get rid of stuff because they didn't have enough room to keep things. This from a government that keeps virtually every record that's ever been written somewhere in archives. Even how to pack a pack mule in 1918 can be found, or how to purchase socks for the Army can be found in the archives. And yet, we don't know who were the major controllers of the armament industries for the Vietnam War. That led on into other things. And while I was working in that area, I started having to go back in history to find out who would benefit from Kennedy's death. And it was Kennedy the first that would have gotten in the way of some sort of power structure that was proceeding towards some sort of accomplishment of an agenda. And it was during this time I had to go back to World War II, and I started discovering cases that had never appeared in our history books. And a lot of the information I had to get came from overseas where it had been recorded, because we basically couldn't find it here. And I ran into a myriad of cases where illegal things had been done. The Constitution had been circumvented, federal law had been circumvented, moral law had been circumvented, and certain entities and certain people and certain corporations and companies benefited in the long run from circumventing these laws. A case in point would be the story of General Shiro Ishii in Unit 731, the Japanese Imperial Army. Unit 731 was officially designated as a water purification unit and was based in Harbin, Manchuria. In actual fact, Unit 731 was a biological warfare test unit. And what they were testing were weapons of mass destruction that could be used on any enemies of Imperial Japan. They experimented with plague, various viruses, various bacilli, anthrax, you name it. There's like 30 deadly diseases that pneumonic and bubonic plague, about 30 diseases that were fatal that they experimented with to find out what they could use as a weapon, while they were also working toward developing their own atomic bomb, but they were way behind us and the Germans. So this was just another area that they could work in, was the biological and chemical, but mostly the biological. They found out that they could kill a lot of people with these weapons, and they experimented on 3,500 Chinese POWs that they'd captured and killed all of them, plus civilians. Plus they sprayed a city in Manchuria to see how the plagues and anthrax and things would vector. The vector is the hardest thing in a biological warfare weapon, is how does it get from one person to another? Is it airborne? Is it waterborne? Is it in the food? And once they were satisfied these things worked, then they wanted to know if it would work on Caucasians. So they decided that they needed some guinea pigs. For that, they sent out an order for captured American POWs. And 1,000 American POWs who had survived the Bataan Death March, who were located at Camp O'Donnell in the Philippines, were transported aboard the Totori Maru. They called it the hell ship because people died in the holes in the ship while they were being moved from the Philippines. And they took them to Korea. And in Korea, they were put on trains, and they were taken into Manchuria, and they were deposited at Mukden in Manchuria. They were experimented on as human guinea pigs. And during these experiments, they would tie these guys to stakes and set off bombs nearby that were filled with all kinds of different germs. They would make them breathe air that had been infected. They would have them drink water that had been infected. They would lace their food with viruses and bacilli. And then they would take these guys at the various stages of their disease, and they would do live vivisections on them with no anesthetic. In other words, they strap them to a table alive and do an autopsy to check the progress in the organs. Now, you ask, what does that have to do with us? Well, here's what happened. We got word that the Japanese were doing this during World War II. Some Japanese prisoners had been captured in Burma and had told their captors that Unit 731 existed. She was there, and this is what they were doing. And we started to fear that they might try to figure out a way to deliver these systems to the United States. And when in actual fact they did figure out a way. They were known as balloon bombs, and what they would do is they would put these different types of diseases inside of glass fishing floats, large glass globes, and these balloons were made out of rice paper and rubberized canvas and things like that, and they would send them in the jet stream across the Pacific to the Pacific coast of the United States. Trying to figure out where these balloons would land, they would use incendiary bombs, and then they would wait and they would read the newspaper reports, their spies would, to find out where they landed. And they found out that there were some forest fires that had been started, and that most of them had landed in the Pacific Northwest. But they also sent some bacillus balloons over. During this time, one of them landed in New Mexico, one landed on a ranch in Montana, and were discovered and turned into the government because some of the people thought they were weather balloons or some type of camera balloons. And a gentleman named Colonel Murray Sanders from Fort Detrick, Maryland, which is a bacteriological warfare test station at the time, went to these two locations and examined these items, and he went back with the samples and everything, and they said that if this stuff gets to this country, we got a serious problem. They decided to try to figure out, if it got to this country, how fast would this stuff spread? So one day they took a destroyer escort out of San Diego, early one morning before the sun came up, and on the fantail of the destroyer escort was a large tank of influenza virus. And they sprayed it into the air in the offshore breeze as they steamed all the way up to Los Angeles, and they infected all of the beach communities. And that year, there was an outbreak of an influenza epidemic in Southern California, and over 200 people died. This epidemic was started on purpose to find out just how fast the stuff would spread if it was, say, bubonic plague or pneumonic plague or anthrax or some other disease. That was only one experiment that occurred. There was another one that occurred in San Francisco Harbor, another one that occurred in New York City, and then one in the subways in Washington, D.C., where American civilians were subjected to these things without their knowledge. They were used as human guinea pigs. Now, at the end of the war, when we were trying every Japanese admiral and general we could find in the war crimes tribunals in Tokyo, and MacArthur was hanging all of them that were found guilty of war crimes, Shiro Ishii's bunch, the Unit 731, had pulled out of Manchuria, had gone to Korea, and then dispersed back into the Japanese population in civilian clothes and told not to ever meet again. The Russians invaded China, of course. They took over the camps at Pingfen, Harbin, and Mukden, and they released the remaining live American POWs. There was about 200 of them. Now, two of these POWs were Warren Welchel from Tulsa, Oklahoma, and Greg Rodriguez from Okmulgee, Oklahoma. They come into the picture again in a minute. When Sanders returned to Fort Detrick after examining these devices and after the end of the war, he was ordered to go to Japan and find Ishii, find every staff officer he could find any records he could find of this, and then offer them a deal. And when he got to Japan, he was met there by a Japanese gentleman named Naito, who already knew what he looked like, already had his picture in his hand, and took him under his wing for about 2 weeks until he figured he could trust him, and then he arranged for meetings with Ishii and some of the other staff members, and they cut a deal. And the deal was, none of these people, even after killing in the most barbaric manner over 800 American GIs, POWs, who had survived the Bataan Death March, they would not be tried. They would have an immunity to prosecution if they would produce the slides, if they would produce the documentation, the samples, and so on, and all their notes that they could come up with over their experiments on live human beings to Fort Detrick. And that's exactly what happened. So these people never stood one day of trial. They never stood up for war crimes. And instead were granted immunity at the highest level. And the highest level at that time, of course, was the President's office, which was Harry S. Truman. This was at the same time, by the way, that a similar operation was going on in Europe known as Operation Paperclip, where we were taking Nazi scientists by the hundreds and moving them illegally into this country and putting them to work in projects at the end of the war for us. That's where the Werner von Braun rocket team came from. That's where General Walter Dornberger came from, SS General Walter Dornberger, who was in charge of the V-1 and V-2 projects at Peenemünde and later on Mittelwerk in Bavaria, where they used Jewish prisoners out of the concentration camp at Dora, and over 2,000 of them were starved to death working in the mountains there as they carved out by hand through granite caverns in which to build the assembly lines for the V-2 rockets. These people never stood trial for war crimes as well. We also took scientists out of concentration camps and brought them over to this country. And one of the individuals who was responsible for bringing all of these people over here and circumventing the Nuremberg war crimes trials, and in fact actually came up with the idea to have the war crimes trials in Nuremberg instead of scattered around, under his control was a guy named John J. McCloy. Now, McCloy had been the head of the State War Navy Coordinating Committee. He had been the overseer of all military operations in Europe from the SWNCC, and they were the committee that decided what the military would do and what it wouldn't do, and when it would do it, what targets that the Air Force was allowed to bomb and what targets would be spared, and so on down the line. Well, at the end of the war, McCloy ends up going to become the first president of the World Bank for Reconstruction, which is the World Bank under the UN, the newly formed UN, which was started in San Francisco in 1945. And then now he became the guy in charge of figuring out what cities in Germany would be rebuilt after he was the one that decided which ones would be bombed. And he also decided where the money would go and how much money would go there. And was responsible for transferring gold out of Fort Knox into underground vaults at the Chase Bank, which later were transferred to Germany, but was paid back with paper Deutschmarks, hence a exodus of our gold and an infusion of paper that was basically not really backed by anything. After a stint in the World Bank, he ends up going to Germany and becomes the High Commissioner of Germany and supervises the reconstruction of Germany. Later on, we find this gentleman involved in many things through government. He ends up eventually on Kennedy's, actually Eisenhower's staff as the advisor for nuclear disarmament, stays over into Kennedy's staff as the advisor for nuclear disarmament, and then quits because Kennedy started underground testing in Nevada in 1963. And in August of '63, McCloy quit and went back to being a Wall Street lawyer, supposedly, for a while, with Milbank, Tweed, and McCoy in Wall Street. And then in November, Kennedy gets killed, and one of the people chosen to serve on the Warren Commission was none other than John J. McCloy. And this is the same guy that got mad at Kennedy and quit. Now he's going to help try to figure out who it was that killed Kennedy. So you can see that we run into some of these same players over and over again. But going back to World War II again, we had the human guinea pigs in America. We had the human guinea pigs in China and Manchuria. And then we had Warren Welchel and Greg Rodriguez, who came home, who is just an example, two of the POWs. And when they went to the Veterans Administration to try to get help for the ailments that they still had inflicted on them by the Japanese, they were told by the Veterans Administration that never happened. Those camps never existed. There's no record of that. Why? Because it had to be covered up. And the reason it had to be covered up was that had the American people known what had really gone on over there, they would have demanded Shiro Ishii and his entire staff be hung for war crimes in Tokyo. And a deal had already been cut. So that story never ended up in our history books. Operation Paperclip, it was many years later before we found out how many Nazi scientists who were war criminals and had been involved in hideous experiments in the concentration camps, freezing experiments where they froze people to death to see how long it would take, genetic experiments, cutting arms off and sewing them on, all kinds of just terrible, terrible experiments that occurred. And a lot of these people never stood one day of trial, never answered for the crimes, and instead were gainfully employed in this country by military-industrial complex corporations, who later on made many hundreds of thousands and millions of dollars in profits off of some of the things that they were involved in. It was during this time in World War II that something else happened as well. Now, we had the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, and the OSS was not part of the U.S. government per se. The OSS was actually started by a man named William J. Donovan, General Wild Bill Donovan, who was one of the higher-ups in the Council on Foreign Relations in New York City at the time. And they became the covert commando saboteur paramilitary group that went into Europe and worked with the French underground. But what a lot of people don't realize is the French underground, when they first went into Europe, was basically the Corsican and the Sicilian mafia, or actually the Italian underground Sicilian mafia, and the French underground was the Corsican mafia based out of Marseille. And they were using the old drug smuggling routes and the old routes that the thieves used all the time to do all of their criminal activities by avoiding the police against the Germans. The network was already established. That's why it was successful. This was the first time our covert intelligence agencies really started using organized crime to help them out in the accomplishment of the mission, and the waters started getting very muddy at this point. At the end of the war, you have to realize that the American and Allied forces had moved from Normandy east and stopped short of Berlin, and that the Russian forces, the Red Army, had moved from Russia west and ended up going through and taking Berlin. As the Russians moved forward, they captured many POW camps that were filled with American prisoners of war, and British and Dutch and French and some of the other allies. As the Americans moved eastward toward Berlin, they captured many POW camps filled with Polish and Russian, and Ukrainian and Hungarian and different Slavics, basically Red Army types that had been taken prisoner by the Germans, because the Germans had a tendency to move the POWs away from the advancing friendly forces to the opposite front. We had over 100,000 Red Army soldiers and then several thousand others from some of the other satellite countries. The Germans, or I'm sorry, the Russians had captured over 150 to 200,000, we don't know the exact number, Americans and British and French and so on. Stalin wanted all those Red Army prisoners back. And he told Eisenhower that if, you know, I will trade you prisoners. I'm not just going to release these guys to you. I want my prisoners back. And we found out that what he wanted to do was shoot them, because in the Red Army it was illegal. It was against orders to surrender. You just didn't do that. If you did, you were shot as a traitor. And these people had been captured, so therefore they didn't stand their ground and fight till they died, so therefore they were traitors and they would be shot. Eisenhower didn't want to do that, but to make a long story short, they were forced to get our guys back. They had to go into forced repatriation, and they had to fix bayonets and march these guys onto trains and haul them over to the eastern end of Europe, into Hungary and Austria and Czechoslovakia and places like that. Take them off the trains, and they were immediately marched off and shot. We would get some Americans back, but we were trading a lot more Russians than Stalin was giving back Americans. While this exchange was going on, another entity appears, and it turns out that there's a German SS division named the SS Galician Division. Now, the Galicians were actually Ukrainians. They were white Russians. They were anti-communist, and they, instead of fighting for the Red Army against Hitler, they fought for Hitler against Stalin. Stalin wanted these people real bad. There were over 5,000 of them, plus their dependents, so you're probably looking at 10 to 15,000 Galicians. Instead of being sent back to Russia, there was a man named Alan Dulles, who was the OSS chief of station in Bern, Switzerland for all of Europe. And he found out where the Galicians were at, made a deal with them, and spirited them out of the country so that they wouldn't end up going before the firing squads in Russia. And he took them to Greece, then to Italy, then to Canada, then brought them into the United States, and they settled in the New York City area, and they settled in the Dallas and Fort Worth area. And later on, their teenage sons, who were growing up, ended up going to work for CIA and infiltrating back into Russia because they spoke Russian, they knew the territory, they had relatives there, and were used as assets during the Cold War. The problem with all of this is that Stalin found out about it, and he had between 26,000 and 60,000 American POWs that he loaded on trains and he sent to Siberia, and he never gave back, and they were alive at the end of the war. Eisenhower found out about it. He knew about it. We knew what happened to these people. We had names. We had lists. But what were we going to do? The war was over. Eisenhower couldn't find the Galicians. They were gone. He had several, many thousands of other Red Army POWs still in custody who didn't want to go home. No guarantees that we could get the American POWs back, even if we gave his back. So what were they going to do? Well, they came up with a new term. It was called KIA-BNR. Now, KIA-BNR was killed in action, body not recovered. So administratively, they declared these people dead. And the relatives were notified with a nice telegram, a GI check, GI life insurance check, and the notification that your son, husband, brother, whoever, was killed in action, body not recovered, location unknown. Sorry about that, here's your money. When in fact the government did know exactly what happened to these guys, and they never came home, and had been reputed, many of them, to be alive, still working in Siberia in the 50s and 60s. A similar instance happened when I started down that trail to investigate the POW MIA situation. A similar instance happened in Korea. We had over 5,500 American POWs that were put on trains and taken north into Manchuria and later China and into Siberia, mainly to Khabarovsk in Siberia. And then they disappeared into the gulags, into the work camps, and they never came home. And we found ways to write them off as well. But they all were seen going in by many sighting reports as being alive, but when the war ended, we just turned our backs on them and we walked away. Similar thing happened in Vietnam. We know of at least 2,500 people that were left behind when Nixon said everybody was home. Whether they were bodies that were in wreckage that was in the jungle and had never been recovered or not is one thing, but there were too many live sightings. One instance that comes to mind is when Bobby Garwood, a Marine PFC who had been captured by the Viet Cong and later was taken up into North Vietnam and lived up there and in the POW camps, and then later made friends with them just to survive. When he finally managed to get out and he came home, he tried to be debriefed, and he tried to tell government debriefers that he knew of one camp where there were over 600 live Americans in 1978. And no one wanted to hear what he had to say, and instead they court-martialed him as a traitor. and they still did nothing about where he said these POWs were, to even checked on them, as far as we can tell. And the cover-up continues to this day on the POW MIA situation. It doesn't matter how many live sighting reports come out. It seems like we don't hear anything about it, and it's extremely disturbing to me, as having been a military officer, that we would leave our troops behind in the field of battle, and politicians and bureaucrats would write them off for political expediency. Some of these things like this are things that have really injured the trust of the American people when it comes to dealing with those people within our government who use their positions of power and authority to do things that are morally corrupt, often illegal, and many times unconstitutional. And when we really track it down to try to find out why they do these things, sometimes we find out that it appears that they're following some kind of agenda, or they're doing it for their own bank account, or both. So I started looking at some other cases that came to mind. And when I started looking into the human guinea pig aspect, I stumbled across the MK-Ultra project. And the MK-Ultra project started during the Korean War, when the CIA became fearful that the Chinese would be able to create a Manchurian candidate, which would be a programmed assassin, or a programmed spy, or a programmed espionage agent. So they decided they would try to do the same thing themselves and see what they could come up with. This led down a road of many horrible experiments that were done on people without their knowledge here in the United States, both military service personnel and the civilian population as well. At one point, the CIA even established a brothel in San Francisco, and when the Johns would come into these rooms, the hookers would lace their drinks with LSD, and they would have cameras rolling behind the mirrors. The LSD epidemic of the 60s originally came out of the MK-Ultra project. There were hospitals, civilian hospitals, that were involved in this. In Canada and in the United States, there were universities. They had grants. They had black funding. And they were experimenting on their own students at these universities and patients in these hospitals. They were also experimenting on service personnel, telling them that they were doing one thing and actually doing something else. They would tell them that we just want to talk to you about some things, sit down in this room, have a seat in this chair, here, drink this glass of water. But then the subject didn't know that the glass of water had been laced with LSD, and all of course, their activities would be recorded. And in those days, obviously, they didn't know the side effects or reactions of LSD, and it wasn't until later that we found out that there were chromosome damage, side reactions, that it was genetic damage, that a trip could reoccur at any time in a person's life. It could lie dormant and pop up later sometime. And that's kind of a scary thought when you think about where some people might be when they go on another space trip. How about if they're flying a commercial airliner someplace and it's 20 years later? Or engineering a train doing 100 miles an hour, or driving a car with you in the back seat at nighttime on a curvy mountain road. I mean, you just don't know when this stuff is going to happen again. And there were literally thousands of people that were experimented on, and it wasn't just drugs. It had to do with hypnosis, chemicals, lobotomies, all kinds of things. Anything that had to do with mind control or mind manipulation. And we were paying for it, but we didn't know it was happening to us. At the same time, other experiments were going on. We call them human guinea pig experiments. We had military units who were marched across open expanses of deserts after they had been saturated with radioactivity from an exploded atomic weapon. We had troops that were and sailors who stood on ships or stood on barges in the Pacific and watched a nuclear explosion occur to witness it, without them being told that what we wanted to know was how much radioactivity can they take, how much would it affect them at this given distance, and so on down the line. These things were going on quite often, and the people involved in it didn't seem to care that these were American citizens undergoing these things. Whether they're in uniform or civilians didn't matter. They were just considered expendable by the elite, guinea pigs. It was about this time, when we go back to World War II, that we find out something else occurred politically. Just before the invasion of Japan, which is Operation Olympic, we dropped 2 nuclear weapons, one on Hiroshima and one on Nagasaki. The Japanese surrendered. Had they not surrendered, and we were forced to invade the Japanese home islands, we figured it would cost between 2 and 2.5 million American casualties. We had stockpiled Okinawa with thousands of tons of weapons, war equipment, all brand new. Rifles, machine guns, grenades, artillery, tanks, airplanes, everything. At the end of the war, the Japanese surrendered, the troops came home, but what happened to all of that equipment? Well, when you really start digging, what you find out happened to that equipment is it was taken over by the OSS, the friendly guys from the Council on Foreign Relations. And they divided it in half and they took it to two places. One, this is 1950, I'm sorry, this is 1945. 1945 was taken to two places, South Korea and Indochina. Now, in Indochina, it was given to a man named Ho Chi Minh. Now, Ho Chi Minh used this equipment to fight the French and kick them out of Indochina. And as soon as he did, we moved in with OSS and then later on CIA personnel. And we took up also at during the same time in Indochina, also included Laos and Cambodia. We took up and inserted teams into those areas, and this is the same areas where we'd worked with Ho Chi Minh to fight the Kuomintang army, or fight the Japanese utilizing assets from the Kuomintang army, the KMT under Chiang Kai-shek. And when we fought that war against the Japanese over there with OSS teams, we financed it with opium profits out of the Golden Triangle. Well, at the end of the war, the French, by treaty, got French Indochina back, but when the Viet Minh kicked them out in 1953, the war started in 1950, by 1953 they were kicked out, and we moved in, our teams went back in and got involved again with the heroin trafficking. At that time, later it became known as Laos. But in 1950, 1953, there was another war that occurred too. It occurred in a place called South Korea. In 1950, the North Koreans invaded the South. The war lasted 3 years. It became a UN police action because now we had the UN to handle things like this, and we were allowed to fight this war, even though 90% of the assets were American, by the way. We were allowed to fight this war to a truce, not to victory. MacArthur, even though he could have won the war, was relieved by Truman because the intent and the objective of the Korean War was not to win it. The intent and the objective of the Korean War, when you start putting all the pieces together and figuring out who benefited and why we weren't allowed to win it, appears to be that it was a message being sent to the American people that we can no longer fight a war by ourselves, that we have to do it as an international military force. And this one we barely were allowed to win to the point to where we could declare a truce. The war never even, the war still goes on today. It's not over, it's a truce. There was no surrender, it's simply a truce. And in French Indochina, during the same years, the French tried to fight the communists by themselves, and they were kicked out in 3 years. But us, along with the British and the French and the Dutch and the Turks and all the other UN troops that went into Korea, well, we managed to fight our way up to the 38th parallel, and then we held it right there. So suddenly, the message that was sent to the American people is, we got to have help if we ever have another war. Forget the fact that we just won a two-ocean war almost by ourselves. Later on, when Vietnam comes along, we have Kennedy who's going to take us out of Vietnam, but he gets killed, and Southeast Asia gets broken up into two entities. South Vietnam given to the Pentagon to operate within, and Laos given to the CIA. And what's happening over there is international drug running. By 1975, there was like 95 tons of heroin a year, raw, uncut, 100% heroin a year coming out of the Golden Triangle, even though we were out of there, no war to support, no Pathet Lao to fight. But the same entities were still getting the money from it. And they had set up their own international drug running and banking complex. At that time, it was known as the Nugan Hand Banking Complex. And the people who ran these banks were retired American generals and admirals. And it was all illicit drug money. And most of the drugs were coming to the United States and to Europe, some to Australia. Very little stayed there. And it was coming in through the Trafficante drug network in San Francisco at one time, and then later through other ports of entry. and the money was in the millions and billions, and it was going into the same drug laundering and money laundering international scenario, but no war to support. So what was it going for? Where was it going? Who was it benefiting? Well, when we start following some of the players that were involved in Laos during the Vietnam War, during the war in Southeast Asia, we find those same people who worked with the CIA and other organizations as well, ended up also in being involved in the Phoenix program in Vietnam, the assassination program in Vietnam, and then later in Iran, with involved with setting up the Shah's secret police, the SAVAK, and then eventually into Bogota, Colombia, and getting involved in setting up the Medellin and Cali cartels, which are tunneling tons and tons of cocaine into this country, which really got their kickstart during the Iran-Contra affair. The drugs were coming out of Bogota, they were going to Panama, Noriega was raking off a percentage, then they were going to Ilopango Air Base, they were going to Costa Rica and a couple of other places, and then they were being flown into the United States through basically 3 drug routes, one to Southern California, one to Mena, Arkansas, and then one that crossed the border down by Brownsville, Texas in trucks. And it was the land route, it was the backup route. An area you can look at on that one is you might read Terry Reid's book, Compromised. He goes into a lot of detail on the Iran-Contra drug smuggling end of that. But what I found fascinating was the same names kept cropping up all the way through all of these scenarios. And we can take them all the way back to the Bay of Pigs and the Kennedy assassination. They were around then, they were in charge of things then, and they kept cropping up. You can find some characters' names over and over again. Theodore Shackley, Thomas Clines, Felix Rodriguez, and E. Howard Hunt, and several others. These names keep cropping up in various places together, and an international investigation that had the assets could probably discover a great deal about what really went on if they pursued it in the right directions. So all of these things were going on, all under the auspices of the Cold War. We have to keep the communists down. We have to keep the domino effect from occurring. We have to keep Castro in Cuba. We have to keep the Russians from expanding in Africa. We have to keep the Chinese from expanding in Southeast Asia, and so on. But magically, when the fall of the Soviet Union occurs, all of a sudden there's supposed to be no more enemy, and everything's supposed to be fine, when in actual fact what we see now is the rise of terrorism. And it seems to be extremely hard to fight this terrorism, and we run into the words, or the phrase, international and domestic terrorism. Well, we know what international terrorism is. It's been going on for years and years and years. A lot of it is religious-based, a lot of it is ethnic-based, a lot of it is politically based. But then when it gets imported into this country, when you have cells of Hamas and Hezbollah and Islamic Jihad that come into this country, and they start setting up here and doing acts of terrorism here, it takes on a whole new meaning for Americans. And the problem we have is, as Americans out here in flyover land, is why can't the government stop it? Why can't they do anything about it? Well, they probably could, but it seems they've been sidetracked somewhere along the line, specifically at the Oklahoma City bombing, when even though all the evidence and all of the eyewitnesses pointed to Middle Eastern connections, and we're talking Hamas, Hezbollah, Islamic Jihad, whoever they are, even in the wake of the World Trade Center bombing, where we know that it was an Islamic terrorist cell that did the World Trade Center bombing, within 3 days of the bombing, the entire media shift went to clear off the spectrum to the right wing, or the militias, or the neo-Nazis, or this group or that group that were politically on the opposite end of the spectrum from the people in power in the White House at that particular time. Though there was no basis for this, and I investigated the Oklahoma City bombing and saw that there was no basis, no evidence to support this, this is where the media went. They were relying on experts. And I wondered who the experts were, so I started checking it out through my contacts in New York City to find out where the media was getting their information. They were getting it from people like Morris Dees of the Southern Poverty Law Center, a self-proclaimed expert. He's really a con man. He scares old Jewish people and black people into sending him money because he's their big savior. He's going to keep an eye on the militias and the Ku Klux Klan and this, that, and the other and give them a newsletter, and they're going to send him millions of dollars. And then the other is the Anti-Defamation League of the B'nai B'rith, which I couldn't understand. That didn't fit at all into this scenario. Until I found out that they were extremely left-wing later on. I was somewhat naive on who these people were because I was just a policeman trying to do a job. But they weren't, the media was listening to these people who had agendas, who all had private agendas and private reasons to do these things, and were networking with very extreme left-wing types in Washington to get their things done. They were networking with people, I'm sure, like Charles Schumer, Dianne Feinstein, Barbara Boxer, and all of that, because they were the same ones that did the big militia investigations and the militia hearings later on, which was all smoke and mirrors. It was all diversion from what we really needed to look at. And what we really needed to look at that time was the massive infusion of Islamic terrorists that were being brought into this country by none other than our own government. Now, how can I say that? It's very simple. Anybody that's had any involvement in the higher echelons of the VFW or the American Legion or the DAV knows that at the end of the Gulf War, we imported between 3,500 and 5,000, and we don't know the exact number, former Iraqi soldiers that we had captured in the Gulf War. We brought them over here, many of them former Republican guards, specifically the Hammurabi division that was taken just west of Basra. And they settled in this country in many cells around the country. One was New York City, a big one. Another was New Jersey. Another was Oklahoma City. Another was Norman. Another was Dallas and Fort Worth, Houston, New Orleans, Miami, Florida, Los Angeles, Long Beach area, just to name a few. We know of over 100 locations around this country that these people settled in and then formed Islamic Jihad cells or Islamic terrorist cells. We have PLO here. We're not being told about that. We have these people planning on doing things because we have been declared the great Satan by the Iranian terrorists and also by the Iraqi terrorists. And even though the Iranians and the Iraqis don't get along because we're talking the difference between Persians and Arabs, they work together when it comes to a common cause. They have an old saying, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So until the great Satan, the United States, is dealt with, they won't rest because to them it is a holy war. All the indications we had in Oklahoma City had to do with Middle Easterners. But Clinton and Reno stood up on day 3 and said there is no Middle Eastern connection, no matter what the evidence is. Don't confuse me with the facts our mind is made up. So as you can see, what we ran into through all of these things, plus some of the airplane incidents we've had, such as TWA-800, such as which we're pretty sure is going to end up being a missile no matter what they say about it, such as Pan Am 103, the bombing over Lockerbie. We know from all the evidence we've been able to turn up that it was probably a bomb that came out of the PFLGP General Command out of the Bekaa Valley in Syria. Financed by the Iranians. The Iranians put out a fatwa against American jumbo jets after the USS Vincennes shot down the Iranian Airbus in the Persian Gulf, and they offered $1 million an airplane for 10 airplanes. We're pretty sure that Pan Am 103 was probably the first one. We know that Ramzi Youssef, who was implicated in the World Trade Center bombing, who's a Pakistani Baluch, terrorist, had planned to blow up 10 jumbo jets himself, and had actually had been constructing bombs in the Philippines, and he was going to knock down some airplanes that were coming back to the United States from the Philippines. Actually, did set off a bomb aboard one foreign carrier in the Philippines. We know that that Pan Am 103 had a bomb put on board in Frankfurt, on one airplane. It then was flown to Heathrow, was transferred onto the Maid of the Seas, the Clipper Maid of the Seas, the Pan Am 103 jet, and then exploded over Lockerbie because it was running behind on its schedule when it should have probably been over the ocean. Our FBI lab, on the other hand, took a little piece of plastic and determined from that little piece of plastic that it came from a timer built by a Swiss company named Mebo, and that this particular chip and timer had been sold to the Libyans, and therefore it was a bomb that was assembled by Libyan intelligence, and that's all smoke and mirrors. It just turns out that the same individual last week who determined that that particular piece of plastic fit that particular bomb built by those particular people has been reassigned out of the lab, because he's the same one that did not do the proper investigation on the evidence from the Oklahoma City bombing case. In fact, actually falsified some evidence. So who knows what's happened on the Pan Am 103 case? Then you have Cal 007 shot down by the Russians. What's the true story behind that? Well, if you read into the Medusa file, you find out that there's like 3 stories behind Cal 007, just all depending on which one that you want to lean to and where the vast majority of the evidence resides. But it appears that Pan Am 103, it's a good possibility we're finding out now, may not have even been shot down. Did it actually?
Cal 007.
I'm sorry, Cal 007. Hope you can edit that part. That Cal 007 was not shot down, that it actually landed on an island there in the Sea of Japan, off of the Kamchatka near Honoran Island in the Kamchatka Peninsula, because an FAA individual in the air traffic control area of Tokyo radar notified Congressman Larry McDonald's office on the next day that the plane had landed and that everybody was safe ashore in Russian territory, and that McDonald would be returned later. Then a few days later, of course, we have the story of the wreckage and the water and all this, but not one body ever came out of the wreckage. Later on, the Russian divers, interviewed by Izvestia, said it wasn't what we found that was strange, it was what we didn't find. We didn't find any bodies in any wreckage. So where were the bodies? Well, they just happened to have if they landed, and if that story is true, and that's where the evidence seems to rest, if they landed on Russian territory, all those people may have been taken to the nearest large town in Siberia, which just happens to be Khabarovsk, which just happens to be the jump-off point for the Siberian gulags. And they were taken in and never brought back. Why would that be significant? Why would it happen? Well, one possibility that's been expressed by investigators and journalists is that because Congressman Larry McDonald was on board, and he was very anti-communist, and he was intent on exposing the ramifications of the Federal Reserve System, the Council on Foreign Relations, the globalist agenda, the New World Order crowd, all of that, and he was getting far too dangerous and too vocal and had to be taken out. Whether that's true or not, maybe someday we'll know the whole truth if we can find all of the evidence to support it. But the multi-millionaire mystery writer that everything she issue that makes them stick their head up and say, wait, something's wrong here. What's going on? You know, I think we're being lied to. Then they start looking at it that way. But, you know, everything we've talked to up to this point, the question comes up, where's it all going? You know, you've told us all of these cases, you've told us all of all these incidents. What's your point? The point is that during my investigation of all these different case files, so to speak, these histories, is that I discovered that there are people inside of our government, and I'm not anti-government, I'm very pro-government. I took an oath to support and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic, as a police officer and as a military person. And there's no expiration date on that oath. I know we've got the best government in the country, or in the world. And the problem I'm seeing with it is it's being corrupted and it's being used as a tool against the American Republic. It's being used by people whose interest isn't in the best interest of the United States of America. We've been lied to so many times now, and we've found ourselves lied to so many times now by people in those positions of authority, inside of the government, whether they be elected, whether they be appointed bureaucrats, whatever, that they seem to forget who hired them. and instead appear to be working for somebody else somewhere, some other entity, somebody higher than government, at least higher than our government. And because of that, the American people have become very distrustful of anything that goes on in Washington anymore, and it's hard to tell who the good guys and the bad guys are anymore. We're finding that there's this big agenda that seems to be unfolding as we come up on the year 2000 that is pushing us toward a global government. The UN, I think, was probably the first major step. They tried to do it with the League of Nations during Woodrow Wilson's years. Didn't work out. No one would buy off on it. They had to start over again. And we have basically international elitists, people with a lot of money. We're talking families and monarchies who've been around for hundreds of years, who are pushing toward this global entity, this new world order, if you will, through the international corporations, through the banking complexes, through the military-industrial complex, through virtually anything that they can utilize as a tool, whether it be treaties, whether it be agreements, NAFTA, GATT, whatever it is. It's a series of events that are occurring very rapidly that's destroying the national sovereignty of this country, getting us away from nationalism and pushing us into globalism. Clinton uses the term redistribution of the wealth. Well, redistribution of the wealth can also be taking away from one country and giving to another country, bringing your first world nations down to second nation status, and raising the third world nations up to second nation status, to where we have just this one level of interest out here as far as people are concerned. But yet there's an entity that's in charge of all of that, and that's where I think this is going. This is where there is a few people who are in charge of everything, and then everybody else is worker bees. That's kind of a simple breakdown of this globalist idea, this international plan, this new world order, whatever you want to call it. But the bottom line is, we have seen in our lifetimes so many instances of where the government appears to have been this evil force that's done many things that are just outrageous. They've lied to us. They've done things that are illegal. When it's not the government at all. It's people within government who've gotten into certain key positions who are able to use that power to accomplish other ends that's not in our best national interest. Cases in point. During my quarter of a century as a police officer, I grew to respect the FBI greatly. But recently I've seen the FBI turn, since Hoover left, turn from a national investigatory and law enforcement type body into what appears to be more of a Praetorian Guard. It's whatever is good for the Bureau or good for the administration is going to be done, whether it's good for the people or the nation or not. And there's people in power inside the FBI that have accomplished that. And they're not the only culprits. There's other agencies as well. Case in point would be Waco. We watched a situation go down that was never adequately investigated afterwards by Congress. That every time they tried to get to the bottom of what really went on at Waco, there was a lot of smoke and mirrors that were turned up by certain people on the committee that pretty much destroyed the investigation and never let it proceed to where it should have gone. We know, for instance, that in videotape that has surfaced since the Waco incident of the infrared system in the airplane overhead, that there were tanks crashing into walls behind the building before we ever saw any tanks in front of the building. As a police officer, it bothered me in the sense that there's women and children in this structure, and they're pumping in all of this tear gas in an enclosed structure. And then, of course, we had the fire afterwards, and the rest of the story from there. When theoretically a tactic to use on what we would call an armed and barricaded assailant situation would be to build a fence around the place. Reduce your assets, and then just wait for them to come out instead of going in there with tanks and helicopters and gas and and hard rock music on PSYOP speakers and all the rest of that. What was the rush? There is no rush. The FBI was the first one in the 70s to tell us as SWAT team members that in a hostage situation or in an armed and barricaded situation, time's on your side, there is no rush. Take all the time you want. And then they violated their own rule. Why? We may never know. Oklahoma City. We know that we have been lied to on numerous occasions involving Oklahoma City. Instead of doing a proper investigation, what we saw the government involved in was damage control. We know that there was a John Doe 2. We know that there was a John Doe 3, 4, 5, 6, and so on. Where are they now? And how come that the government side of the case is, we're going to hang McVeigh and Nichols and go on down the road and put this behind us? And then the government turns around and tries to sabotage its own case. All these things about the FBI lab, all these things about McVeigh did all this stuff by himself. And they've even got him driving the truck by himself now, when all of the eyewitnesses saw two people in the truck across the street from the post office. They saw two people get out of the truck in front of the Murrah building. They saw two Middle Eastern males in blue jogging suits at the front door leave in a brown pickup truck. An APB was put out by the FBI that the FBI later came along and denied. We know that there were Middle Eastern connections in this thing. Tons of information has been given to the federal investigators, of which it appears that nothing has been done with. And then the crime scene itself was destroyed when they brought the building down. No satisfactory explanations have ever come concerning the seismic events that were recorded in 3 locations, showing 2 and 3 equal events of equal intensity and equal duration. And we found out many other things as we investigated the Oklahoma City bomb. We know that there's a connection that goes down into Mexico. And in Mexico, by the way, we know that there's a very large PLO cell whose sole mission is to infiltrate PLO terrorist teams into the United States to use American neo-Nazis or anybody else they can find, they call them neo-fascists, to accomplish terrorist events in this country that they will take the blame for, therefore serving as a cutout. And that's kind of what we saw in Oklahoma City when we saw all of this diversion to the militias and the neo-Nazis and and anybody else that was politically incorrect, so to speak. But nothing was followed up on the Middle Eastern part at all. Nothing was followed up on the Mexican connections at all. In TW 800, we saw several times where lies were just told, just plain lies. We had an individual who was a Navy 4-striper stand up during one of the briefings that the NTSB was holding early on in the investigation, and he said that there were no military exercises in the neighborhood, in the vicinity.
Continue on. I've got much more using the clock.
Hmm?
Just keep on talking. I'm hardly even getting the clock.
Okay. He said that there was no military exercises in the area on national television, on CNN, when we know, and we knew then, that the Normandy was in the area, a guided missile frigate. We know that 2 Army National Guard Blackhawks were in the area. We know a P-3 Ryan was in the area. We know a Coast Guard cutter was in the area, and the possibility that there was a submarine in the area. We also get an unnamed Pentagon spokesman who says that the aircraft was out of the range of a shoulder-launched surface-to-air missile. Now, when you go back and you look, you find out that the airplane started out, it was 8,900 feet, then it was at 9,500 feet, then it was at 10,300 feet, then it was at 13,500, and the altitude kept growing depending on what it took to get it out of the range of the threat. Kind of like the truck bomb in Oklahoma City kept growing when bomb experts would come in and say, well, 2,400 pounds of ammonium nitrate wouldn't do this much damage. 3,600 pounds wouldn't do this much damage. 4,800 pounds wouldn't do this. Now we got 5,000 pounds of ammonium nitrate fertilizer that supposedly blew half this building down. Then he said that even at 10,000 feet, 13,000 feet, it was still in the range of surface-to-air missiles. Then they qualified that and said, well, if it was fired from the land. Well, no one said it was fired from the land. It was fired from out at sea because it hit the airplane on the right-hand side of the airplane. The airplane was flying north up the coast, which means that the missile had to come from out at sea. They said, NTSB said that all the engines that they recovered were fine. when we know that number 3 engine was destroyed? When they brought it out of the water, the compressor section was gone, was basically 80% gone. The compressor blades were gone. What was left was burnt and bent. We know that the turbine sections, all the blades were basically gone. This was right on videotape. This was on CNN. We know the engine appeared to resemble the same as those in Vietnam that had taken SAM missile hits. The engine was burnt, it was broken, pieces were gone, and that engine was on a pylon to the right side of the center fuel tank. And if it began spitting hot, fiery parts, it would have penetrated the center fuel tank, which would have explained a lot of things. But you can't have a shoulder-launched missile hit the airplane without bringing some kind of Middle Eastern terrorist groups into it. And that would lead us to what type of a missile and where did it come from? Well, if it was a Stinger, it could have been one of those that was left over from Afghanistan. And if that's true, it would track back to the CIA and the U.S. government. Not that they ordered this airplane to be shot down, but simply for the fact that they lost control of their missiles after the end of the war and didn't recover them, and they ended up in the hands of various terrorist groups by way of the Iranians and the Pakistanis. We also have an individual who said that the airplane couldn't have had the type of fuel explosion that a missile would have caused because it had JP7 fuel, and the flashpoint was non-compatible with that type of an incident, when in actual fact JP7 is not used in civilian airliners. It's Jet A, which is much more flammable. And that airplane was loaded with Jet A. We're told that this radar tape that shows an object approach the airplane at high speed was an anomaly. Then we're told that it may have been a malfunctioning transponder on the P-3 Orion. The problem is when you do the missile or do the track on the target that is moving, we really run into something that's going 1,500 miles an hour. And at 1,500 miles an hour, it's not going to be a propeller-driven P-3 Orion. So because of these things, we're seeing event after event after event that appears to be one cover-up after another. You couple that with MENA, with Whitewater, with all of the other things that have gone on, the Vince Foster murder, everything else that's gone on, and you can't help but ask, what's the deal? What's going on here? Well, a lot of people will say, well, it's this force behind the New World Order is accomplishing all of these things for whatever reason. My investigation didn't lead to the right wing or the left wing at all. As a matter of fact, I don't think that the issue is a conservative or a liberal issue. I don't think it's a Republican or a Democrat issue. I think that one side is played against the other, and that there's another agenda that's occurring here, and they'll use either side. And right now, they're using the left wing as the boogeyman, and the right wing is becoming very defensive. I think if the right wing was in power, they would be used as the boogeymen, and the left wing would become defensive, as it was in the Vietnam War, because all of the domestic disturbances and the riots and the bombings and all of the terrorist things that happened in the 60s were left wing. Now it's all being blamed on the right wing. There's an old adage that goes back to a plan that was hatched in 1773 in Frankfurt, Germany, that one of the keynotes to this group was, it doesn't matter what entities are involved as long as you use both sides. If you support both sides of a war, it doesn't matter who wins or loses. If you support both sides of an issue, it doesn't matter who's right or wrong, as long as in the end you are the one that's remaining and the one in charge and the one that has owns the debt that these people owe you. That leads us up to an elevation above federal government. That leads us up to what you might consider a global elite issue. People who think that there should be a super government over and above all other governments. And these people have been around for years. There's no secret about this. There's no massive behind-the-doors conspiracy. There's been much written. They've got their own publications. They've got their own organizations. They're so numerous it would take a small book to list them all. And they all seem to network together. And even if they don't agree on everything, the common goal is the same. It all gets there in the end. And it's almost a world socialist type of government controlled by a very small handful of people who are able to control the destiny of the nations. To do that, they have to destroy national sovereignty of all the nations in the world to the point to where they become nation states of this super government. And I think that's what this so-called New World Order is all about. It gets us to that point. And they've always had the saying, I've looked at a lot of these groups, that the end justifies the means. It doesn't matter how they get there. It doesn't matter how many people die. It doesn't matter how many lies you have to tell. It doesn't matter how many drugs you have to smuggle or how much money has to be laundered. As long as you get there from here, the end justifies the means, because it will be better for everybody. It's kind of like the Star Trek thing when Spock says, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. Well, that's kind of like talking about a democratic form of government. We don't have a democratic form of government, but a democratic form of government is where if the majority of people vote for something, it occurs, even if it includes eliminating the minority. 10 people meet in a room, 9 vote to hang number 10 gets hung. There's no one there to protect number 10. In a Republican form of government, in our form of government, there's checks and balances to protect number 10 against the masses. These people would use terrorism, they would use war, they would use debt, they would use any tool in the toolbox to get to where they want to go. Because to them, they have another saying, and it's order out of chaos. And if they can create chaos in this country, no matter how they do it, using the propaganda from the mainstream media, using terroristic events, using the Hegelian effect of creating a problem and then having the solution standing by in the wing, a solution we probably wouldn't accept, except now that we are more afraid of the problem, such as the Oklahoma City bombing. They did a poll right afterwards. How many of your rights would you be willing to give up for security? And that was kind of scary, because a lot of people said, oh, I'd give up some. Well, when you start giving up your rights, that is a slippery slope. And we start going downhill very rapidly at that point. Why do people buy off on this? How come they don't see this coming? How come they don't understand what's going on? Well, it appears that a lot of it is because they simply don't know. They don't have the education. They don't have the background. They haven't done the research. This isn't stuff that was presented in the public school system. When you look at that aspect of the whole thing, you wonder just what is the public school system and who really controls it? Well, ever since the federal government became involved in the public school systems, and they started coming up with things like Global 2000 and Goals 2000 and all of these other issues, and they came up with an organization called the NEA, the National Education Association, which was the stepchild of the General Education Board, the GEB, which was originally started by the Rockefeller Foundation and the Carnegie Foundation. Then we find out what their agenda is. And their agenda is strictly globalist. And it's an international super government being the final goal. To do that, you have to use two things to control the minds of the people. You have to use education, and you have to use the media as a continuing education. As we go through school, we get textbooks that are published in New York City. You take a history textbook today and you look at it, you compare it with a history textbook of one printed 100 years ago, and they don't tell the same stories anymore. The history's been rewritten, it's been revised, it's been manipulated. History doesn't change. Once something occurs, it either occurred a certain way or it didn't. Anything outside of that is a lie. Our history has been manipulated to the point in our history books now that our kids don't understand where this country came from in the proper text. So then you go to who controls the publishing houses in New York City that write the history books, and you find entities that lead to these globalist organizations. They're the ones with the money. They're the ones that put the editors in the publishing houses. They're the ones that tell what goes in the books and what doesn't go in the books. I interviewed a teacher once on this, and I said, where do you get your history book? Well, I go to a book fair, and I pick it. You get to pick your own book. Yes, I do. How do you do that? Well, I go up to a table, and there are 10 history books, and I pick one of them. Okay. Who picks those 10 history books? Well, the state educational board does, I guess. They've got a committee that reviews these, right? And who picks the history books they get to review? I don't know. Well, are they recommended by the NEA? Oh, yes. So you see where the loop starts to close now. Russia rewrote its history under Stalin. They left out a lot of things. Under Khrushchev, they rewrote it again. The Russian kids were getting very confused because the history kept changing about every decade, depending on who was in favor of the Tsar, against the Tsar, in favor of Stalin, against Stalin, in favor of Lenin, against Lenin, and so on. We're seeing that occur in this country today. The other thing that we get is a dumbing down of the student population. When I was a company commander, I would get recruits in who had high school diplomas that couldn't read and write. They couldn't fill out the forms it took to enlist in the military. But they had high school diplomas. How did they do that? How did they get through the system that way? Well, that wasn't just an odd thing that happened. That was occurring all over the country. Through the NEA agenda, they were reducing classroom time on the basics, reading, writing, arithmetic, history, and so on, quite a bit, and instead bringing in all kinds of sociological things and all kinds of cultural and multicultural things and racial interdependent things and all of the feel-goodism and all the warm, fuzzy New World Order stuff. They were all putting that in there, but they were cutting down the ability of our kids to compete in the global market and then telling the parents they're getting a great education. So now they graduate and they get out. Where does the education come from now? Unless they pursue it on their own, they're going to get fed what they need to know by the media. And now, because they don't read and write very much, and they don't dig into books anymore, and the reading time has dropped, we have the television watching time that's increased. The average American spends far too many hours in front of the television. And what do they see? They see 10 and 15-second time spots on the 6 o'clock news, and that's all the news you need to know. And it's the slant that the American media takes and what they leave in and what they leave out. Now, all of the things that we found out in Oklahoma City, the things that Channel 4 in Oklahoma City found out on the Middle Eastern connections and a myriad of other things were all fed up pike to the New York City head office. But none of it got out on national media. None of it. It was all stopped right there. That's called spiking the news. So when you spike the truth, what you feed the American public then is what's left over or what you want to be their mental pablum. And people buy off on that, and they accept it because, well, no one in our government would be involved in anything like this. Well, I think we've just demonstrated that there are people in our government who have done things throughout the last 4 or 5 decades that are so despicable that there's no way you're going to find them in history, the average history book. And it happens over and over and over. Now, they talk about, well, there's people who want to overthrow the government. The issue is to locate the criminals who use their positions of power and authority, identify them, and then prosecute them, get them out of government. We need to do a little bit of house cleaning is what we need to do. We need to clean up our own house. And we have to do that by utilizing the law, utilizing the court systems, and doing everything we can to say it stops now because we're not going to pass what's going on down to our children and our grandchildren. An interesting aspect in all of this is following the history of what eventually became the Central Intelligence Agency. At the end of World War II, we had a situation occur where there was a German SS general named Reinhard Gehlen who escaped from Berlin with several trucks loaded down with his staff and documents and microfiche and all kinds of intelligence data. And instead of going west to hit the Allied forces, or obviously east to hit the Russian forces, he headed south toward Austria. And when he got to Austria, he ran into a captain named John Boker. John Boker ended up capturing this entire convoy, complete with this German general, without a shot being fired. And as it turned out, it appeared that Boker had been waiting there to rendezvous with them, because Boker didn't work for the local American Army military command staff. Instead, he obviously was working for the OSS and was reporting to Allen Dulles, who was chief of station in Bern, Switzerland. It appears that he advised Dulles that he had Reinhard Gehlen and his staff and all of these documents, and wanted to know what to do with them. And they ended up hiding these guys out, hiding the documents and everything for a period of time until they could decide exactly how they would proceed with this new asset that came into their hands. And the more one investigates this, the more one becomes convinced that this was set up well in advance, that Dulles probably had known Reinhard Gehlen throughout the entire war. Reinhard Gehlen was the espionage chief for Hitler for Armies East, which covered all of the Eastern Front, Russia. He had spies all the way up to and including inside the Russian General Staff. He had kill teams that went around killing Jews. He had hunter teams that went out and searched down Russian espionage agents and killed them. He also had recruiting teams that went out and recruited Russians to serve as part of his spy apparatus for Armies East. Gehlen was spirited away and hidden for quite a while. The war ended, and Dulles returned home. And in 1945, the OSS was disbanded by Truman, and in the end of 1945, 1946, Dulles went to Harry Truman and he said, look, we've got to have a intelligence organization that can coordinate all of the intelligence gathering efforts of the services. You've got military intelligence over on the Army side of the house, you've got naval intelligence over in the Navy side of the house, and these guys don't even talk to each other. And now that we're faced with this big boogeyman, the Russians, we have to have a way to put this information together from all of our intelligence resources and form the big picture and see what's going on. And he said, well, what do you suggest? He says, well, what I suggest is you allow me to form an organization to replace the OSS. Truman says, I'm not going to have any paramilitary commandos running around blowing things up and getting involved in things I don't know about. He says, well, sir, he says, what we need is we just need a way to assimilate all this information and put it together, and we can advise you what we found out so you'll know what's going on. He says, well, you know, now that's not a bad idea. I tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to let you form an organization. We'll call it the Central Intelligence Group. Yeah, that's a good one. We'll call it the Central Intelligence Group, and we'll give you the old whack barracks down there on the mall, and I'll fund you for 300 clerks. And so they started out with about 300 paper pushers and file clerks. Then within a few months, old Dulles goes back and says, Mr. President, we've got a serious problem. We're finding out that there's 100 and some odd Russian divisions in East Germany that are just waiting to rush through and head for the English Channel. And he says, my God, where they get all these people? He says, well, there's all these Russians there, and they built this thing. He says, where'd you get this information? He says, well, it's just the trickles we've been able to put together. So because there was a troop gap, we were committed at that point to send people in to reinforce all of the occupational areas of Germany, which of course, we had to go buy more stuff to do it with. We had to pay more different types of salaries to more people. And then, about a year later, he comes in and he says, sir, he says, we got another problem. We've got a situation where we've got, where we're finding out that they've got too many bombers. They got more bombers than we've got. So we had a bomber gap. Now the bomber gap is something we've really got to look at, because now the Russians have got all these bombers over there. So eventually what happened was Dulles convinced Truman that we needed a much bigger spy apparatus to spy on the Russians. His suggestion was that we take the Central Intelligence Group and we expand it to agency status and get authorization for about 3,500 agents and personnel. That occurred in the National Security Act of 1947 when the CIG became the CIA. And interestingly enough, within a few months we had 3,500 people involved. And it turned out what we did is we inherited the Galen Org, the Reinhard Galen organization that had been quietly waiting to be reactivated. All of these Nazis and all of these Russians had been waiting to be reactivated, and they were reactivated when Dulles did that. And Dulles then was able to come back later on during the Kennedy administration and say, gee, we got a missile gap. We got to have more missiles. We got to have more of this. We got to have more of that. The end result of a lot of this, of course, was the buildup of the military-industrial complex after World War II. Instead of losing money, we had to buy new equipment. We had to buy newer airplanes. We had to buy newer tanks. We had to buy newer ships and newer submarines to keep up with the pesky Russians. When in actual fact, when we go back and examine the intelligence reports from those days from the other countries' intelligence gathering resources, we find out that the 100 and some odd divisions that were ready to storm through the Fulda Gap and through some of the other places in Eastern Europe actually were half-strength, war-weary, worn-out divisions who all they wanted to do was go home. They were only kept there because the Russians wanted to keep them there as a defense against any aggressive move from the West. Most of their transport was horse-drawn. The trucks they had didn't have parts. The tanks they had were obsolete. The aircraft they had, most of them were worn out. And then when we get to the bomber gap, we find out that the bombers they had weren't anywhere near as good as the ones we had, and they weren't intercontinental. They couldn't carry anything to this country if they had to. The missile gap, we found out, was totally false. They didn't have half as many missiles as we thought they did, as at least that Dulles and the CIA told Kennedy. Kennedy found out later that that was a big lie, that when we got the satellite program in use and some of the other spy assets into operation, we found out that there was no missile gap after all, but by then we had increased the number of warheads and missiles that SAC had and so on. Bottom line was, as we went through the rest of the Cold War, basically what we did is we outspent the Russians. But what it also did is it put us $3.5 trillion in debt, buying all of the things it took to maintain the Cold War and to keep the technological edge against the dark forces of the East, as I believe Reagan used to call them. So we also find out when we look at the CIA that the CIA isn't necessarily an organization that specifically works for the United States government or the people of America. The CIA, when you look at it, we find out that all but 2 directors of the CIA are actually high-ranking individuals in the Council on Foreign Relations. And the Council on Foreign Relations' objective, of course, as they've published all the time, is a trend toward global government. It was the Council on Foreign Relations that set up the United Nations, totally outside the realms and the bounds of the Constitution. The Council of Foreign Relations puts people into every administration. Every president, with 2 exceptions, were members of the Council on Foreign Relations. Every Secretary of War and every Secretary of Defense and every Secretary of the Treasury were members of the Council on Foreign Relations. That's one common thing that held them all together. Now, as a policeman, you look for ties. You look for something that holds something together, something in common throughout all of these different things that went on, and we find these same globalist organizations involved, whether it's the CFR here, whether it's the Royal Society for International Affairs in London, or any number of other organizations around the world that all seem to mesh together in a common objective. And that common objective, of course, is this strive away from nationalism into globalism and an international super government, so to speak, and they're the ones that want to be in charge. I think the big experiment toward this ability to be able to control the population of the planet actually occurred in microcosm in Russia. The Bolshevik Revolution and all that followed that was a so-called grand experiment into how do you control the masses of the people if you're in charge. Well, you can control them by debt, you can control them by intimidation, you can control them by fear, you can control them by sheer power, or you can control their minds and make them think that they're in the best place in the world and everybody else is worse off than they are. You can also pick and choose from these various methods and kind of combine them together and mold it like clay one way or the other until you have a situation where the population poses the least threat to the hierarchy. Now, the hierarchy are those people who think that by birthright or by bank account or by design are the ones that are supposed to be the kings of the world, the emperors of the empire, the people who are ultimately destined to be in charge. What a lot of people don't realize is their idea of the one world government, so to speak, is basically being able to have the masses all believe they're all equal, they're all the same, no one is a have-not. They may not have very much, but everybody's got something. And when you really start breaking down this one, what we call the second world type scenario, it's not a first world power anymore, and it's not a third world power anymore. Everybody's been equalized now. When we break it down to that second world scenario, we have the peasants and the worker bees, the producers, and then we have the thinkers and the leaders, the elite. And only they are the ones that will know the true story behind things. They're the ones that will have the reins of power. They're the ones that will decide who lives and who dies and who prospers and who doesn't. They will be able to control who travels and who doesn't travel. And what you will see is basically what they tried to do in Russia, with, depending on who was in charge at the time, it changed a little bit with each dictator, a socialistic or a communistic form of global government, where everybody's got one cow, or maybe half a cow, but nobody has a herd. Because if you have a herd, then you'd be rich. And if you got rich, then you might have capitalistic ideas, and that would be politically incorrect. And because you would be better than your neighbors or more well off than your neighbors, you become a threat to your neighbors, and you would have to be brought back down again. That partially crippled the Soviet Union, because there was no incentive for workers in Russia to work. Why put out a quality part? As long as you put out 50 parts a day and you made your quota, you got paid the same amount. It was a very small amount, but it was enough to get by. Why work hard to put out good parts if you could put out enough parts? So the system really doesn't work. The elites never quite figured that out, but they keep trying to monkey with it and make it work to where they don't have any competition coming up from the ranks. And I think we've seen that in private corporations. We've seen it indeed in government, where it's the people that get promoted have a tendency not to want to promote anybody as smart as they are or smarter than they are, or somebody that would be a threat, because they don't want to end up having someday to have that person promoted beyond them and them have to work for that person after that person had to work for them. You'll run into the same thing in the socialist countries. You have basically two classes, the ruling elite and the rest. That is basically where this whole thing it seems to be going right now, with the global elitist versus the masses, the unwashed masses. And I think that that is the big threat to mankind. Now, when I was working on the Medusa file, and I was working on Kill Zone and some of the other investigations I was involved in, I kept following these power brokers higher and higher, trying to figure out who thought they were in charge today. Was there one council working on all of this? Was there one room where these people get together who are the world's big leaders, who we may not even know who their names are? And it seemed like every time I would get up to a point to where it looked like I could identify a small organization that was right up there, they really didn't have a handle on some of the other things that were going on around the world. That seemed to fall under somebody else, but there did seem to be one driving force behind it. And the driving force was just basically very evil. It was going against biblical teachings, and it seemed to go to where we get to in the Bible when it begins to talk about the Antichrist. So if you're religious or not, please consider the fact that a lot of this had been written down years and years ago in the Bible and had been prophesied to occur, and now we're coming up on the millennium, the year 2000, and I think that the people who know that they're on the evil end of the dark side, so to speak, that are trying to promulgate this type of a government entity, I think they know that they're limited in time and that the year 2000 is a magical number, and that's why we're starting to see some of these things occur. And it doesn't matter whose toes they step on, it doesn't matter how many lies they tell, how many people they kill, it doesn't matter as long as they get to where they're trying to go before the bell rings. Because of this, I also found out that many other investigators had done a great deal of work on satanic organizations around the world and indeed in this country. And there is a huge satanic movement in this country as we speak. There are people who are kidnapped, there's children who are abused, there's human sacrifices that go on, and you ask yourself, how could that occur in a modern country like this? That old superstitious voodoo stuff. Well, the fact is, it doesn't matter how it occurs. The fact is, it does occur. Police departments know about it. Federal agencies know about it. Congress knows about it. Investigations have gone on into these various organizations. And what we find out is many of the politicians in high places actually are involved in many of these things. And to get more in depth than that, people like John DeCamp and Ted Gunderson have done a great deal of investigation into these areas and found out that the satanic movement is alive and well in the United States. There's other organizations that have been explored, and there's other government entities that have been involved in things we don't understand that seem to be cropping up around us. Jim Marrs has done a great deal of research into those areas, into the covert intelligence communities, and to some of the government's bizarre projects, the remote viewing projects, and some of the other things that have gone on. And we'll probably be writing about it extensively as well. So there's a lot of people out there who have done a lot of good work in the right directions. Now it's a situation of trying to put all the pieces of the puzzle together and seeing what kind of picture develops. But my gut feeling on the whole thing is right now in this world we have a major battle ensuing between the forces of good and the forces of evil. And that, I think, breaks it down to the most basic common denominator.